If you're visiting today, we're so glad to have you with us. The way that we do sermons at the church is typically we'll pick one book of the Bible that we'll work our way through the course of several weeks. And this entire year, we've been studying the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. They were actually written by the same person. And so we started Luke actually back in December. And today we're going to be talking about Acts chapter 22. We have just 6 more weeks of Acts, and then we're going to be switching over to our Advent sermon series the last week of November. So I'm excited to shift gears a little bit with you come November. Following Christmas time in January, we're going to do a topical sermon series on suffering. So I'm really excited about that, not because suffering is fun, but because we all experience suffering and know what that is like. We'd love to have you with us to continue studying God's Word together. And as I get ready to share God's Word, I'm going to dismiss our kiddos for Children's Church. You're going to be heading out with Judy Clay today. So we do have Children's Church. If you would like to join, this is a child-appropriate lesson, and we'd love to have you join in with them. During seminary, I had to read a lot, and I mean a lot. A stupid amount of reading. The accrediting association that gives Denver Seminary its accreditation requires theological schools to assign, I think it's something like 500 pages of reading per credit hour. And most classes at Denver Seminary are 3 credit hours, so that means per class, students are required to read up to 1,500 pages. That's per class. So if you're taking about 3 to 4 classes per semester, it means you have to read approximately 6,000 pages of books and articles in a 3-month span. I had a professor that once said, coming to seminary is a lot like trying to drink from a fire hydrant. You're going to get shot in the face with all of this stuff, and you're only going to retain a little bit here and there, and that's really true. Out of all of the stuff I read in the 6 years I was at seminary, I think a lot of it is lost in the databanks of my brain somewhere. But there are certain books and articles that I read that really stood out and I refer to from time to time. And the reason I share that with you is because I was reminded of a book that I read, I think, during my first semester of seminary called The Rise of Christianity. It's a really interesting book. It was written by a sociologist by the name of Rodney Stark, and the book's premise is essentially that Christianity should not have grown the way that it did in the first century. This was a really small sect of Judaism, because remember, the earliest Christians were Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And it wasn't very popular early on. We have actual numbers of conversions that took place in the early church, and while Acts is quick to point out, hey, there were a lot of people who were converting to Christianity on a daily basis. Compared to other world religions, it was still really small at its earliest point. And so the author of this book argues Christianity should not have grown the way that it did, but it grew. And he explores in each chapter the reasons why Christianity exploded the way that it did in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So there are a lot of reasons. Obviously, part of that is God's intervention in the church, God's leading of the church, God's Spirit equipping these earliest Christians to proclaim the gospel. But among all of the other reasons, the one that stood out to me this week is Stark argues that Christianity grew the way that it did because of the way that the earliest Christians reacted to opposition. Instead of shying away from those who opposed them, Christians turned occasions of opposition into opportunities to share the gospel, even if it meant that they would be killed. I shared this with you a few weeks ago. There was a church father named Tertullian who once said, the blood of the martyrs is essentially the fertile soil of the church. And that's true. There were a ton of martyrs in the early church Christians who were asked to recant of their faith, and they didn't, and they were killed either by the government or leading religious authorities. And for me, the thing that really stands out about that is that there was so much courage displayed by these early Christians, and that's what the book argues. It was the courage of these believers that ultimately showed the watching world, hey, if these people are willing to die for their faith, they must really believe that Jesus came back to life. And we've really seen that kind of courage displayed a lot throughout Acts. We're 22 weeks into this study. We've seen a lot happen. We've covered a lot of ground. And through all of the various persecutions that the early church faced, we have seen the leaders of the early church stand against opposition with courage and boldness. Remember Stephen. Stephen was arrested after false charges were brought against him by the Jewish leadership. He was brought to trial before the Sanhedrin, which was essentially the leading Jewish legal council. But instead of defending himself, Stephen delivered an impassioned sermon about Jesus being the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises to the people of Israel. And I know that Stephen knew that doing this would ultimately result in his death. He knew that such a response would put his life in jeopardy, but he was undeterred because he believed that the gospel was worth the risk. Like Stephen, Peter also had tremendous courage in the midst of opposition. He too believed that occasions of opposition were opportunities to share the gospel. Following Stephen's death, persecution against the church continued to grow. And at first, it was largely religious in nature. The persecution was largely religious in nature, but eventually it turned political as well. We talked about several weeks ago how Herod Agrippa stepped into the scene and he launched a large, widespread, and violent attack against the church, especially targeting the leadership of the early church. He went after James, the brother of John, first and had him killed. And then he targeted Peter next. He had Peter arrested. While Peter was sitting in prison waiting for his trial to commence, an angel appeared in his cell and freed him from prison. So he escaped. And as I was thinking about that as I was working on my sermon this week, I don't know about all of you, but I really don't have a rebellious bone in my body. I'm a rule follower to a T, so if I get in trouble for something one time, I will probably never, ever, ever do it again. So if I had been in Peter's shoes, if I got arrested by one of the leading political authorities in Israel for speaking truth and proclaiming the gospel, I probably would have retired from ministry and would have found a nice, quiet place to live. Thankfully, Peter had way more courage than I do, and instead of retreating, he continued to preach because the opposition he faced only emboldened him to seek out new opportunities to share the gospel. And of course, what about Paul? We have been following Paul closely the past several weeks, watching as he too faced opposition in nearly every city that he went. In nearly every city that he went. From nearly every people group he encountered, the Jews hated Paul. They did not want to hear his message about Jesus. The Gentiles were more receptive to his message, but even then, there were certain Gentile groups who also hated Paul and led riots, literally led riots against him. Even some Christians spoke harshly against Paul. What really stands out to me about Paul is that his life following conversion was really marked by constant opposition. But like both Stephen and Peter, Paul remained steadfast and continued to share the gospel despite all of the risks. And we're going to see a vivid example of this in today's reading from Acts 22. Paul had concluded his third missionary journey, and as we talked about last week, he had just arrived in Jerusalem. A few prophets had warned Paul not to go to Jerusalem because the Spirit had shown them that Paul would be arrested if he went there. Remember, we talked about Agabus. Agabus took Paul's belt and he tied up his hands and feet, saying to Paul, "This is what's going to happen to you if you go back to Jerusalem." But Paul was determined. He knew that the presence of opposition invites the privilege of opportunity. So he and his companions went to Jerusalem. And the Christian leaders there told Paul, "Hey, the Jews here really don't like you, Paul. And we know that if you come into the city, they're going to come after you. But we think that there are a few things that you can do to maybe smooth things over with them to create some common ground." So in Acts 21, we read that Paul and his companions went through this ritual purification ceremony, even though he didn't think it was necessary for a follower of Jesus to do such a thing. But ultimately, it didn't matter. There was nothing that Paul could have done to appease the Jews. They had an agenda against him because his message about salvation was so radical to the Jewish mind. The moment that Paul stepped into the temple, we're told that the Jews stirred up the crowds. And Luke notes that the whole city was aroused and people came running from all directions. And eventually an angry mob seized Paul and tried to kill him. News of this reached the tribune. The tribune was the commander of the Roman troops in Jerusalem. And he quickly dispatched soldiers to quell the crowd. When the rioters saw the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. But the soldiers were confused. The tribune was confused about who started this riot. So they arrested Paul, not the rioters. They arrested Paul. As Paul was being brought into the barracks, he turned to the tribune and asked to speak to the crowd. All of the people that had gathered there to fight back against Paul. He speaks to this Roman commander. He says, "Hey, I have something I want to say to these people." When the tribune gave him permission, Paul stood on the steps of the barracks and motioned for the people to be silent. There was a great hush, and Paul began to speak to them, and that is exactly where today's passage picks up. I'm going to invite Vicki Schussler to come forward to read for us. Vicki's going to be reading Acts 22, verses 1 through 22 today. If you have a Bible and would like to follow along, I'd encourage you to do so. We'll also have all of the verses on our PowerPoint screens for you to follow along with. Let us listen into the Word of God together.
Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I now make before you. When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. Then he said, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them in prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. From them I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and to bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. While I was on my way and approaching Damascus, about noon a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' Then he said to me, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting.' Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I asked, 'What am I to do, Lord?' The Lord said to me, 'Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told everything that has been assigned to you to do.' Since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus. A certain Ananias, who was a devout man according to the law and well spoken of by all the Jews living there, came to me, and standing beside me, he said, 'Brother Saul, regain your sight.' In that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. Then he said, 'The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear his own voice, for you will be the witness to all the world of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and have your sins washed away, calling on his name.' After I had returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus saying to me, 'Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him.' And then he said to me, 'Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'"
I want you to take note of Paul's response to this angry mob. Did he tell them how mad he was at them for attacking him? That God would punish them for harming one of his sermons? Did he call them names or slander them? No. Paul simply shared the testimony of his conversion. As he faced intense opposition from people who literally wanted to kill him, Paul took the opportunity to tell the people about the saving power of Jesus. Have any of you seen Hamilton? Either a recording of it or the actual show? A few of you. I have to be honest with you, I am not a huge fan of musicals, but Krista is. So every now and then I will indulge her interest and we'll either go see a musical downtown or watch one on TV. So the most recent one we watched was Hamilton. There was a recording done on Broadway and it's on Disney+. So if you have Disney+ and you want to watch Hamilton later today, you can. The reason I mention that is because this whole conversation about finding opportunities to share our faith in the midst of opposition reminds me of a song from Hamilton called My Shot. Those of you who have seen Hamilton might know the words to that song. It goes, "I'm not throwing away my shot, I'm not throwing away my shot. Hey, yo, I'm just like my country, I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot." See, the question that we have to ask as we're studying this story of Paul sharing his testimony with this angry crowd is, why in the world did he, bloody, bruised, and in handcuffs, want to share his story, his testimony, with people that wanted to kill him? I think the reason that he did this is because Paul, throughout his entire ministry, we've seen this happen again and again, he worked really hard to share the gospel with the Jewish people. They were his own people. And he viewed this opportunity as the perhaps last shot that he would have to share the gospel with his own people. Despite his calling to be the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul loved his fellow Jews, and they were his people. They were his family. And it's kind of like, if we love someone enough, we're going to take a shot when love is on the line. We dare to speak the truth of our own stories when a family member is about to disengage from us. We dare to speak the truth when we have fallen in love with someone. We dare to speak the truth when a friend lies in a hospital room with terminal cancer. In those kinds of situations, we don't throw away our shot either. Not every conversation requires bold truth-telling, but if we're going to live the gospel story well, and this is commentator Dean Pinter saying this, if we're going to live the gospel story well, we need to recognize Paul's speech for the remarkable witness it is. What he did was to tell his personal story as part of God's larger story in the world. His story, like yours and mine, is important. As Fred Buechner writes in his memoir, my story is important not because it's mine, God knows, but because if I tell it anything like right, the chances are you will recognize that in many ways it is also your story. And it's one of the things that I love most love about being a pastor is I get to hear people's stories all the time. And you've heard me say this so often, is everybody sitting next to you has a story to tell. Where they've been, where they are, where they're going. I love to hear those stories. And if I have time, I also really enjoy sharing my story too, about how God has been with me in my own life. And it's really true that telling stories is really as basic to us as humans as breathing. Not everybody can write poetry, not everybody can solve math equations or build a skyscraper, but most of us can tell our story. Most of us can tell our testimony. This is why for us Christians, we've been talking about how we share our faith and how the early Christians shared their faith. And one of the things we see from this text is that for us Christians, there is no more powerful way to share the gospel than to simply tell others the story of how we came to know Christ and how he is at work in our lives to transform us. That's what Paul did. That's the opportunity that Paul took as he was facing these crowds. He shared his testimony, and he was passionate with his words. He wasn't angry. He offered a reasonable defense of his faith, but he wasn't cynically defensive. He was assertive, but not vengeful. And again, if I was in his shoes, I don't think I would have maintained his kind of composure. I would have wanted these people who attacked me to get their just desserts, but not Paul. He maintained a loving balance. How did he do that? How did he tell his story so well? What gave him this courage to stand in front of this mob and take his shot? A few things that we should take away as we think about sharing our own story with people, as we think about sharing our testimony with those who we encounter throughout the upcoming week. The first thing that Paul did was understand his past. There's enough shame and regret in everyone's past that we might simply want to ignore or forget it, but Paul didn't do that. One of the first things he told the crowd that was gathered is, you know what? I was one of the people who led intense persecutions against the early church. Paul recognized one of the most creative and restorative dimensions of the gospel is the ability to use the substance of the past in the present. When he says, I am just as zealous for God as any of you today, he was sympathizing with his fellow Jews, again, creating common ground with them. More than that, he was taking all of that was meaningful to him in the past, even the difficult lessons that he learned, and he was carrying them into the present so that he could continue to build bridges with these people. He wanted them to hear his story, and so he did what he could to build common ground with them. The second thing Paul did was recognize how God takes initiative in our lives. There is no part of heaven or earth, past, present, or future, in which God isn't involved in leading the way. Jesus is ahead of all of us to meet us on the road. The Lord brings devout friends and family like Ananias into our lives to heal us, to direct us, teach us, and bless us. Remember, Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He was blinded, and then he went to see Ananias, and Ananias was leading him around and eventually helped Paul to heal. In the same way, God brings people into our own lives to encourage us as we seek to share the gospel in the midst of opposition. The third thing Paul did was openly welcome his future and obediently do all that God commanded him to do. And all of that is really to say that at some point in our lives, you and I will face opposition as a result of our faith. From non-believers, maybe even from other Christians, just like Stephen, Peter, and Paul. And I've talked about this a lot over the course of the past several weeks. When we talk about persecutions as Christians living in 21st century America, we have it so easy here compared to other brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. You and I really don't have to fear losing our lives for being practicing Christians. But nonetheless, there will be occasions in our lives where we face criticism or perhaps even harassment because of our faith. It could be at work, at school, even at home. And as followers of Jesus, we have to imitate Jesus, the life that he lived. And when we do that, it might cause opposition. The question is not whether or not we'll face opposition as believers. We will. That's a given. Instead, the question that I want you to ask this morning is, how do we respond to opposition? Someone asks you a really hard question about your faith that you don't know how to answer, or somebody points out something that they think is inconsistent in the Bible. How do you respond to that? Somebody attacks your theology. How do you respond to that? Do you run away from it? Or do we believe that the presence of opposition invites the privilege of opportunity? And what I want to suggest is that when someone comes after you for your faith, the best thing that you can do is share your testimony. Tell them about God's power in your life. Tell them about the grace of Jesus, the love of Jesus, and how you are just doing your best to follow Jesus each and every day. Don't throw away your shot. Decide to tell your story, even though it might be a difficult and daunting thing to do. It is such an important, life-giving thing. And I just want to wrap up really quickly. There was a study that was recently done trying to determine what the biggest predictor of somebody who maintains their faith would be. So we know that when a lot of young people move off to college, if they've been raised in a church, they stop believing or they stop attending church. And so this study was trying to determine why certain young people end up maintaining their faith. And the study found that those who maintain their faith after college saw Christianity modeled for them by their parents. So they had people in their lives not only telling the story of how Jesus saved them, people in their lives living out the story each and every day. And that is our challenge today. We don't just say the right words and hope that people will become believers. We have to live it too.